Hugo Sperrle's story begins far from the flame-lit skies of the Blitz and long before the thunder of German bombers echoed across Europe. Born on February 7, 1885, in the Württemberg town of Ludwigsburg, Sperrle grew up in a disciplined, comfortable middle-class household. His father, Johannes, owned a local brewery, respectable, prosperous, and steeped in the values of order and duty that defined Imperial Germany. For young Hugo, the military was not only a way to serve the nation, it offered a clearly structured world where ambition, loyalty, and obedience promised advancement. At 18 years old, on July 5, 1903, Sperrle joined the Imperial German Army as an officer cadet. By 1912, he had earned his commission as a lieutenant, and a year later he rose to Oberleutnant. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Germany's sudden need for capable officers accelerated his path. By November 1914, he was promoted to Hauptmann, captain in the artillery branch. His early service was typical of young officers on the Western Front. He directed batteries through the brutal trench warfare, where artillery, not tanks or planes, dominated the battlefield. The mud, monotony, and lethal precision of artillery duels defined his daily reality. But Sperrle's career would soon pivot in a direction that would determine the rest of his life. As the war dragged on, aircraft evolved from scouting novelties into indispensable tools for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and intelligence gathering. Sensing an opportunity, Sperrle transferred to the Luftstreitkräfte, first serving as an observer, a dangerous job that required flying over enemy lines in slow, vulnerable biplanes, and later training as a pilot. By 1917, he commanded a reconnaissance squadron responsible for mapping enemy trenches and guiding artillery fire. These missions lacked the glamour of fighter aces, but they required precision, endurance, and nerves of steel. His efficiency and organizational ability impressed superiors, solidifying his reputation as an emerging air officer. By the end of the war, Sperrle had become deeply embedded in Germany's military aviation. But in 1918, the armistice changed everything. The Treaty of Versailles reduced the German army to 100,000 men and completely banned military aircraft. The once imposing air service was dismantled. Pilots were grounded. Dozens of officers left the military altogether. Yet Sperrle stayed. Like many career officers, he quietly continued serving in the Reichswehr, waiting for a moment that seemed impossible at the time: the return of German air power. During the 1920s, Germany covertly studied aviation tactics despite the ban, working through disguised programs and illicit training arrangements abroad. These were years of military stagnation for most officers. But Sperrle's methodical nature fit the era. He kept a low profile, studied aerial strategy, and prepared for a future no one could openly talk about. By the way, this video isn't free. The price? A like, a comment, and a subscription so you never miss our next deep dive into forgotten military history. That future arrived in 1933 when Adolf Hitler took power and immediately began rebuilding the armed forces. Sperrle's patience paid off. In 1934, he was promoted to Generalmajor and joined the newly formed Luftwaffe. At nearly 50 years old, he became part of the generation responsible for transforming Germany's forbidden air service into a modern war machine. But his rise had only begun. His next assignment would place him at the center of one of the most controversial air campaigns of the entire 20th century. When Hugo Sperrle took command of the Condor Legion in November 1936, he stepped into a conflict that would shape both his reputation and the future of aerial warfare. The Spanish Civil War was not merely a struggle between Franco's nationalists and the Republican government. It was a laboratory for the next global conflict. And Sperrle, with decades of aviation experience behind him, was now the man assigned to test Germany's growing air power. Officially, Berlin claimed the Condor Legion was sent to support a friendly regime fighting Bolshevik influence. Unofficially, it was a proving ground, a place to test new aircraft, new bombs, and new tactics away from the scrutiny of Versailles. Sperrle's mission was simple in theory, but ruthless in practice. Coordinate
Long-range bombing, close air support, and air-to-ground integration with brutal efficiency. Under his leadership, the Condor Legion became one of the most feared air units of the conflict. Its operations included escort missions, bombing raids, attacks on supply lines, and the destruction of vital infrastructure. But one operation would overshadow all others: Guernica. On April 26, 1937, German bombers and fighters, many under the broader oversight of Sperrle's command, executed an attack that shocked the world. For hours, waves of aircraft bombed and strafed the Basque town of Guernica, igniting fires that consumed homes, markets, and civilians, fleeing through the streets. The raid became one of the earliest and most infamous examples of modern terror bombing. To this day, historians debate Sperrle's exact role. Some argue he directly authorized the attack. Others believe the decision was made by Wolfram von Richthofen, who commanded tactical units on the ground. What is certain is this: Sperrle was the senior commander of the Condor Legion, and he defended its operations unapologetically. The destruction of Guernica would follow him for the rest of his life. International outrage erupted immediately. Newspapers across Europe and America condemned the bombing. Picasso immortalized the tragedy in his mural Guernica, turning Sperrle's campaign into a global symbol of civilian suffering. Yet within Germany, Sperrle's reputation only grew. Berlin hailed the Condor Legion as a success. The lessons learned, coordinating fighter escorts, improving dive bombing accuracy, and integrating air support with ground offensives, would shape Luftwaffe doctrine for years to come. By October 1937, with Spain serving as his crucible of modern war, Sperrle returned to Germany a seasoned commander whose name now carried weight inside the Luftwaffe's highest circles. The experience boosted him far above those who had never fought in real combat conditions. In February 1938, he received command of Luftwaffengruppenkommando 3, which soon evolved into Luftflotte 3, one of the most strategic air fleets in Hitler's rapidly expanding war machine. From this position, Sperrle helped coordinate the Anschluss with Austria and played a key air role during the crisis over Czechoslovakia. Hitler used the threat of overwhelming air bombardment as a diplomatic weapon, and Sperrle's fleet was central to that psychological pressure, even though not a single bomb fell. By the time Europe stood on the brink of World War II, Hugo Sperrle had become one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and trusted commanders. He was no flamboyant showman like some of his colleagues. Instead, he was valued for discipline, organization, and his ability to make air power function at scale. But his greatest test and his greatest failure was still ahead: Britain. When Germany launched its invasion of France on May 10, 1940, Hugo Sperrle was already one of the Luftwaffe's senior commanders. His air fleet, Luftflotte 3, was responsible for supporting Army Group A as it pushed through Belgium and the Ardennes. While ground units executed the famous breakthrough at Sedan, Sperrle's bombers and reconnaissance aircraft played a crucial role, striking rail junctions, troop concentrations, and defensive lines that threatened to slow the Wehrmacht's advance. Throughout the rapid collapse of France, Sperrle's units operated at a high tempo. From May to June 1940, Luftflotte 3 concentrated on isolating French forces, disrupting British movements, and preventing organized resistance. When British troops retreated toward Dunkirk, Sperrle's aircraft were deployed to support the effort to encircle and destroy the pocket. Though the Luftwaffe ultimately failed to prevent the evacuation, the campaign nevertheless solidified Sperrle's standing. His coordination of wide-ranging air operations earned him recognition from both Goering and Hitler. On July 19, 1940, after France fell, Hugo Sperrle was promoted to General Field Marshal, the highest rank in the Wehrmacht. For a man who had spent decades as a quiet, efficient staff officer, it was a remarkable ascent. Now he stood at the pinnacle of the Luftwaffe alongside figures like Hermann Göring and Albert Kesselring. But his next mission would expose the limits of Germany's air strategy. As the Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940, Sperrle's Luftflotte 3 formed the northern arm of the Luftwaffe's offensive. From occupied France and the Low Countries, his aircraft targeted ports, shipping lanes, industrial centers, and Royal Air Force bases. The early goal was straightforward: wear down fighter command and clear the skies for a possible invasion of southern England. However, the campaign soon revealed deep strategic problems. The Luftwaffe lacked heavy bombers. Navigation systems were limited. Fighter escorts had short ranges. And British radar, combined with an efficient control system, turned RAF fighters into a coordinated defensive network. Sperrle's forces suffered heavy losses during attacks on airfields and radar stations. His staff analysts warned that the German plan was failing to achieve its intended objectives. Some historians argue that Sperrle quietly supported continued assaults on RAF bases, believing that Britain could not withstand sustained pressure. Others suggest he followed Göring's shifting orders without protest, focusing on execution rather than strategic debate. The turning point came in September 1940, when German leadership redirected bombing away from airfields and toward British cities, the beginning of the Blitz. Although Luftflotte 3 participated in city raids, the change weakened the pressure on the RAF. Fighter command recovered, and Germany's chance to gain air superiority slipped away. The failure to defeat Britain became one of the defining setbacks of the war. After the battle, Sperrle's air fleet transitioned to a defensive posture along the western coast of Europe. Luftflotte 3 carried out raids on shipping, coastal defenses, and occasional night operations, but its strategic role diminished rapidly. As Allied air power grew, Sperrle faced mounting challenges. By 1943, his unit struggled against well-escorted American bombers and the increasing presence of long-range fighters. Reports from the period describe Sperrle as increasingly frustrated. He understood that his air fleet was under-equipped, overstretched, and unable to compete with the steadily growing Allied air offensive. Yet he continued to follow orders, directing a shrinking force as losses. The decisive blow came in June 1944. When the Allies launched Operation Overlord, Luftflotte 3 could barely respond. Reduced to a fraction of its former strength, Sperrle's fleet was unable to challenge Allied aircraft dominating the skies over Normandy. 2 months later, in August 1944, Sperrle was dismissed from command and placed into the Führer Reserve, an administrative retirement for officers no longer trusted with major responsibilities. His wartime career had effectively ended. But the greatest surprise in his story was still to come: the courtroom. When the war ended in May 1945, Hugo Sperrle was no longer a prominent figure of the collapsing Third Reich. He had been removed from command months earlier, sidelined as Germany's military structure disintegrated. But his name still appeared on Allied lists of high-ranking officers to be detained and investigated. Unlike many Luftwaffe leaders, Sperrle had spent much of the war on the Western Front, involved in major air campaigns and strategic bombing operations. That alone made him a candidate for prosecution. In October 1946, Sperrle stood before the International Military Tribunal during the High Command trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. The charges against him centered on two key issues: the conduct of Luftflotte 3 during the Battle of Britain, and alleged involvement in reprisals, forced labor policies, and civilian bombings in Western Europe. But the case against Sperrle quickly ran into problems. Unlike officials from the SS or Gestapo, he had no direct ties to ideological programs. His air fleets had operated under conventional wartime directives, and prosecutors struggled to establish that he knowingly ordered illegal bombings or reprisals. Many of the air attacks attributed to him were indistinguishable from broader German military strategy, actions that, while destructive, were not considered war crimes by the standards of the time. Testimony from Allied air officers added an unexpected twist. Several stated that strategic bombing campaigns conducted by all major powers, including Britain and the United States, blurred the legal boundaries. As one analyst later noted, prosecuting Sperrle for air operations would have opened the door to reciprocal accusations. The tribunal ultimately concluded that insufficient evidence existed to convict him on any count. In October 1948, Hugo Sperrle was acquitted of all charges. His release did not mean a return to influence. Germany lay in ruins, the Luftwaffe no longer existed, and former military leaders faced public distrust. Sperrle retreated into a quiet life near Munich, living off a modest pension and occasionally giving interviews to journalists or military historians. Those who met him described a man outwardly composed but deeply resentful of the regime he once served, particularly its political interference in military decisions. He repeatedly emphasized that the Luftwaffe's failures stemmed from unrealistic directives, inadequate planning, and the refusal of Nazi leadership to listen to professional officers. Whether this was genuine reflection or post-war self-preservation remains debated by historians. During his final years, Sperrle maintained contact with a small circle of former officers, many of whom sought to document the collapse of German air power. He contributed to several post-war studies, offering insights into command structures, intelligence assessments, and the challenges Luftflotte 3 faced as Allied air superiority grew. Yet he avoided public attention and rarely commented on Hitler or Göring directly. On 5 April 1953, at the age of 67, Hugo Sperrle died in quiet obscurity. No major ceremonies marked his passing. Unlike some German commanders who published memoirs or sought rehabilitation, Sperrle remained a largely forgotten figure outside academic circles. But his story stands as a stark example of the contradictions within the Luftwaffe. A competent professional who rose quickly, commanded vast air fleets, participated in pivotal battles, and yet ended the war sidelined, acquitted, and ultimately overshadowed by the failures of the institution he served.